감사합니다. It's a great pleasure and a great opportunity to be here to learn from Korea in research integrity. Korea is such a rapidly transforming and sophisticated research system. It's a pleasure to be here. 감사합니다. 저는 한국말 못해요. 합니다. Sorry. And sorry also for my accent from Australia. Yep. Today it's a great pleasure. I would like to talk about three main things. I would like to talk about research integrity as a research subject and overall. And I would also like to talk about plagiarism and some recent advances in our understanding of plagiarism. And finally, I'd like to talk about the role of universities and institutions from someone who works in an institution in this area, in the research of research integrity, but also the administration of research integrity. My first outline for the first chapter is about research integrity and that research is predictably unpredictable. It must be, therefore, trustworthy, that the application of the principles of research integrity are highly dependent on individual discipline practices, from the humanities to arts to sciences and life sciences. And sometimes researchers make mistakes. Research is a human activity. Research is a process of creating and organising knowledge. The process itself is non-linear, it's unpredictable. And so we can describe it as being a part of iterations of steps that sometimes look very strange. So the steps, individual steps of the iteration of building knowledge sometimes terminate, sometimes they don't fit well together, but that's how it works. And sometimes we have mind-blowing paradigm shifts. Research always has impact, so there's been a large focus on looking at research impact. And we think about this often as researchers as impact factor of journals. That's not really impact. Research always has impact. The impact of research can be small, it can be large, and you never know when it will happen, and you never know what you're going to get. So this is a graphic representation of the highly technical publications made by two Australian researchers into human papillomavirus vaccines. They are all highly technical publications in low impact factor journals, but together it's a complex equation that produced a vaccine that is making better human health. So trying to determine exactly the impact within the equation is very, very difficult. What it really emphasises is that each step can be very fragile, and so every step and every production must be trustworthy. Similarly is the invention of Wi-Fi. So we ask ourselves, where did Wi-Fi come from? Actually, Wi-Fi is Australian, it comes from Australia. But people at the Australian Research Institute have looked in detail about how Wi-Fi was invented. And that's represented there in the middle. Again, it's a complex series of steps and people interacting with each other. But it actually originates from World War II, the World War II radar. The engineers and scientists and researchers working on World War II radar would never have expected that their work, their research, would allow us to understand the universe with radio astronomy, or make deaf people be able to hear with a cochlear implant, or that we could watch cat videos whenever we want on the phone. And you never know what's going to happen. This is a very specific parasitology publication, a very elegant study from the 1960s that by all measures of citation and other measures didn't have any research impact until one citation in 2013. This careful, elegant study of a parasite's nose and the micro needles that it uses to attach to hosts informed the development of new biomaterial for medicine. So the original author would have never expected that his parasitology, his examination of a parasite, would lead to this development. His work was great for parasitology, and then one day, far away in the future, his work was used again. So the research, the impact of research is predictably unpredictable. Research requires trust, therefore. And research integrity is the concept that makes research trustworthy. But it also makes it excellent. So research integrity around publications, what to do in a publication, or how to look after your data, they're all research integrity. And so they can make research excellent. Research integrity underpins the positive impact of research. It's not occasional, it doesn't come in and go out. It's always, it's intrinsic. Actually, it's what you do as researchers every day. These are the principles, high-level principles: honesty, accountability, professional courtesy and fairness, and good stewardship. They're very high level. They're very high level, but research, integrity and research all contains these 5 things. But in order to understand that and how those principles actually work is highly dependent on a complex system of individuals working together, one-on-one, actually individuals having their own expectations about research, communities, so different backgrounds, different cultural backgrounds. It's very, very dependent on discipline. We see this we see this a lot in plagiarism, understanding plagiarism from life science compared to the humanities. And we see this in very, very interesting traditions in authorship. And authorship can be very, very weird sometimes. There are lots of expectations and lots of conventions. Responsible research and research integrity is the norm. This is what happens normally. However, sometimes researchers make mistakes, and sometimes they will recklessly breach research integrity, or they'll breach research integrity principles, the basic principles, intentionally or deliberately. This is because we are human, the good and the bad. This looks like a spectrum disorder of behaviour for research. Accepted practices and good understandings and implementation of the principles into the discipline is responsible conduct, essentially, trustworthy conduct. And from there is behaviours that are decreasing in frequency but increasingly deviate from the norm. And at the far end of the spectrum are things such as fabrication, falsification and plagiarism. Evidence suggests that these 3 things happen within a population of researchers somewhere between 2% and in some reports up to 15%. There are lots of different deviations, and some are minor and some relate to sloppy research. And perhaps some of those minor and sloppy errors or mistakes or intentional deviations in responsible data management have more impact than anything else. More impact than fabrication, falsification, plagiarism. And that's possibly why researchers it's finding difficult to reproduce research. But why do people do this? Okay, they're human. You can think about this in very many different ways, some cultural aspects and other things, but as humans we are susceptible to our own behaviours and what's been described as fraud triangle. This is a combination of three concepts for fraud, which is around opportunity, need, and then a justification to oneself to move outside the boundaries, to go from responsible into the spectrum disorder. So in terms of research integrity, greatly informs research practice, trustworthiness, excellence, and deviations from the norms, so deviations and breaches of research integrity. There are many different types, and I'd like to talk now about plagiarism. I understand it's quite a hot topic here in Korea for various reasons. It's a hot topic has been a hot topic in Germany and Eastern Europe. Australia is waiting for it to become a hot topic. It will become a hot topic in Australia one day. I'd like to talk about there is no such thing as self-plagiarism. That doesn't make any sense as a word. I'd like to talk about research recycling and being generous. And I'd like to talk about recent advances. Well, plagiarism is a very old concept, and I'm not sure if there are very many recent advances, but perhaps we hope there are. These are some excuses from people who are found to have committed plagiarism in America. And so some people blame other people. Some researchers who have plagiarized say things like, someone else wrote that, okay? I trusted them. You know, it's not my fault. Of course you trust your colleagues. Of course you trust researchers. But then there's other interesting excuses. The reviewers are smart enough to know what's mine, or what's other things, and what's my words. And then sometimes people make up very elaborate stories about viruses and computers, and going outside to see birds, and coming back, and my work was plagiarized. But my personal favourite is just someone who said, I used the same words, but I meant something different, which is an interesting concept. Plagiarism is defined in lots of different places. Probably the best one, in our opinion, Paul and my opinion, is from Canada. It's defined as presenting and using another's published or unpublished work, including theories, concepts, data, source material, methodologies, or findings, including graphs and images, as one's own, without appropriate referencing, and if required, without permission. So this definition gets at the heart of it, an academic theft of stealing something from someone else, which is what it is, really, in plain speaking. But what this actually allows, this definition allows the idea that plagiarism can occur in many different forms, the material can be in many different forms, and that there are actually discipline-dependent appropriateness. There's appropriateness there. So sometimes it might be okay to use information a certain way according to your discipline. It can occur at any stage of the research life cycle, from proposing, conducting, and publishing, but it's best understood in the publishing area. That's where there's actually really hard, solid data for this. But it also occurs is an interesting overlap with authorship, because it's about credit and giving appropriate acknowledgement, and also increasingly in the peer review system, where peer review system is confidential and retained, and what happens when you're a peer reviewer is that you get a privileged position to see new information, novel ideas, novel ways of writing, and you see that confidential information. You can't unknow that. You can't, as a researcher, you can't unknow things that you see and you learn. So it's interesting how being a peer reviewer informs your own practice, and how people sometimes don't maintain confidentiality, and that's an interesting form of plagiarism. I'd like to talk about responsible recycling. And this is in Daejeon, this photo. A very good and a very beautiful city. Irresponsible recycling? It's a question mark. We're trying to work on this concept. Basically, it's about redundant publication, but we're trying to think about this, about how researchers might inappropriately use their own ideas and thoughts in their research without referencing it properly. But mostly, this is about redundancy in publishing. So that might be just copy and pasting the same data twice, one publication and then another, without acknowledging the fact that you did that. It might be completely okay if you, as long as you write in the publication, in the figure legend or at the very front, this information first appeared in this article or this book chapter, and I'm presenting it again. Therefore, you're not plagiarising. Therefore, you're not irresponsibly recycling. Excuse me. It's also interesting with the idea of salami, which I really love salami, and so I like the idea of salami publication. But this is where you publish just little bits, salami, and you try to inflate your publication record instead of making a very nice place where people can learn and use your knowledge to generate more knowledge. There is no such thing as self-plagiarism. Self-plagiarism as a term, it doesn't make any sense. You can say redundant publication, or you can say irresponsible recycling, but you can't really say self-plagiarism. So you can't steal from yourself unless you have a very smart accountant, maybe, I don't know. And in terms of plagiarism, normally the recycled work is referenced appropriately, so you get the credit again. No such thing as self-plagiarism. There is very good arguments for recycling information. There's very good arguments for this. It is highly discipline dependent. We best see this in the natural sciences and life sciences, biomedicine, especially in the area where the addition of new words or new ways of writing things, expressing things, is not as important as being open and clear. It's not as important as allowing researchers to be able to reproduce and replicate your work. So we see this in, it's okay sometimes to recycle in introductions, in materials and methods. It's probably not okay to recycle in certain areas of a discussion or where scholarship is important. This is highly discipline dependent. The idea of this responsible recycling for some humanities is it's not going to work, except for areas of common knowledge. But in the life sciences, biomedicine and other sciences, there's very good arguments for just saying, here's my materials and methods this time, and here it is again, and it's 90% the same. It's 80% the same, and it should be. Plagiarism and irresponsible recycling can be avoided by responsible referencing and attribution. That's it. It's very simple to cure this. And the flip side of this, the other side of this, is it's very easy to cure the idea of making or reducing allegations or better understanding what you think is plagiarism and what isn't. And this is the idea, the concept of being generous in research. Sometimes researchers who are learning to become a researcher have a difficulty in understanding what's their idea, their own ideas, and how ideas have been formed in collaboration, and how those ideas are expressed. We see this in students who often say, but that was my data, that was my idea, I did that experiment. Where in fact what they were doing was working in a collaborative environment with supervisors, postdocs, other researchers, other people who all contributed to that. And so the ownership is complex. The principles of authorship can be very helpful here. Authorship is the honest reflection of a contribution. Authorship itself should be assigned fairly and consistently, communicated clearly and transparently, and should be generous while remaining true to the requirements. And so this general idea of generosity works as long as you understand what is scholarship and what is referencing and appropriate referencing and discipline. I put in my title, Recent Advances, but plagiarism is such an old idea, such an old concept. Some recent advances might actually not be novel. They might not be new. But next I'd like to talk about some evidence around plagiarism, the increased scrutiny, especially about post-publication peer review, the human element, and the importance of discipline conventions. Although very well understood in humanities, there's actually quite nice data now from the journal articles of the life sciences, and interestingly, a large proportion of retractions in life sciences are due to plagiarism and irresponsible recycling. This is quite a large proportion of this. And normally this sort of event, these sort of misbehaviours happen in low impact factor journals, as opposed to fabrication or falsification, which are more often seen, retractions for those events are more often seen in high impact factor journals. So very good discipline specific journals, Nature, Science, Cell. So there's an interesting difference between, well, trying to get away with copy paste, no scholarship in a low impact factor journal versus the pressure to produce data for a very, very high impact journal. There is increasingly sophisticated tools to detect similarities. So looking at similarities overall and things like statistically improbable phrasing. These are tools such as cross-check and Turnitin and large automated systems that reference, when they look at a document, reference a large library and come up with a percentage. These are often sometimes called plagiarism tools or plagiarism detector. It's not, they're not plagiarism detector, they're just similarity detector. Funding agencies in the US, the National Institutes of Health, they are looking at how peer reviewers behave after seeing privileged information. They're looking at having what do peer reviewers do, what do they produce after getting an opportunity to peer review. So looking at plagiarism in peer review. And a small funding agency in Australia is also looking at this. One of the most exciting and interesting developments in this whole area of research integrity has been the post-publication peer review, where really what it is a response to the market. People want to scrutinise work more closely. People have a passion for this. They might be a small number of people who are very passionate about it, but overall, everyone in the public, and you and me, and research communities, everyone should have access to the information. Well, that's an argument anyway. Perhaps not everything. But this increased scrutiny of post-publication peer review has been very interesting in detecting fabrications and falsifications, and sometimes plagiarism. It's important to remember that if you produce a paper and you think that's it, or a book, that you think that's finished, it's not. There's no final version. There's no final version. There will be always some sort of interesting development with it. Despite this, what we see in our institution is that plagiarism, allegations of plagiarism, are just from one person looking at another person using their work. It's not very sophisticated on the ground, at the coalface. And so, although plagiarism is detectable by machine, it's nowhere near yet definable by machine. Probably will never be. It will never be. Determination of plagiarism or irresponsible recycling requires human academic judgment. Okay, you might need more than one person on a panel to come to a consensus or to come to a decision, but it always comes to human. And the human element is very important and interesting in this area. This is a case study of plagiarism or allegation of plagiarism. And when I say the human element, it's not only in the decision of plagiarism, but even just how plagiarism occurs and how people respond to it, depending on who they are and where they are in the status or the hierarchy of an institution. A PhD student working with their supervisor in the life sciences, in the biomedical area, so very collaborative. She produced a PhD thesis, a solid meritorious PhD thesis, and found that her supervisor had seemingly, or it appeared, that they'd plagiarised text and data in 3 different research things. So one was a journal article, a research output. One is a conference abstract, which was a research output, and a grant application, which is authorship and plagiarism is not quite the same for a grant application compared to a paper. So in the yellow are the actual highlighted areas. This is a pretty close case study. And so the PhD student didn't know what to do. This seemed very unusual to her. And in Australia and other areas, cultures around student rights and the role of students and supervisors working together may be different, but she needed advice for her. So she went to her co-supervisor. In Australia, she could have also gone to a research integrity advisor, independent academic, but her co-supervisor helped her. And the co-supervisor looked at this with her and made the determination to help her, to say, actually, you know what, this is not okay. But they actually made the complaint. So sometimes the human element means the students, other people, are unable to speak freely. Plagiarism was found for some of these things and not for others. This was dependent again on a human academic to make a decision, not a computer. And for the journal article, authorship was offered to the student to remedy, because the attribution will fix the output. But she didn't want to do this, and so it was retracted. There are other considerations in plagiarism, and with a large number of students from overseas or international students coming to Australia, we're understanding now that actually becoming an academic where English is not your first language is a huge energy cost. It's an extra layer of difficulty. It's interesting to know that there's lots of amazing work and paradigm-shifting work that's not in English. Of course it's not in English. But unfortunately, perhaps there are lots of advantages that it's in English now, but we're realising that there is interesting pressures created by not being able to speak natively in English, and there's a maybe more emphasis on data. Cultures are important and language is important. Discipline appears to be most important. And so a very interesting analysis of editors in China and the West for English journals in China and the West. Most editors from the East and the West agree on what's plagiarism. From different disciplines, there's large differences. And so you think about what are the impacts of different deviations, and looking at authorship, fabrication, plagiarism, or loss of data. And you can look at this seismograph away from the actual event, where individual researchers can be affected, the research group can be affected, and then from there out to the record. And plagiarism is interesting in that it affects individuals and disciplines and possibly the record because of the replication of information. But it's nowhere near as impactful as the loss of data. If you do great work and you lose it because you'd have poor data management, that's probably worse. And the impact of plagiarism and irresponsible recycling in research is very difficult to assess. So we know that it perturbs credit systems and erodes scholarship, but these are very hard to define. So it's a dynamic thing, where as we go on in this journey together in research, perhaps opinion about plagiarism changes quite dramatically. It doesn't necessarily reduce the trustworthiness of research, but it reduces, I guess, the trustworthiness of scholarship, of the process. And again, this is very well described by colleagues from Canada. And Canada are doing an amazing job of making really sensible policy and guidelines for their institutions. So plagiarism, perhaps it is a breach of research itself. Perhaps it's more about the process of the research process of conducting it. Finally, I'd like to just talk about the role of institutions and the incentivisation of research integrity, the influence of it. We all work together with research institutions, individual researchers, publishers, the government funders, societies, and the public, the human participants, and others all have to work together for research integrity. The most obvious three candidates for influence are publishers, funding bodies, and other societies, and research institutions. If that system of communication or understanding between those three bodies is not aligned or not very well understood, then it's very difficult to get anything done. And we see this a lot with publishers. And publishers say the same thing about institutions. They say some institutions are hopeless. They don't ever get back to us when we have a problem. And we say the same thing about publishers. We're gradually getting better at talking to each other. An institution has to show certain things, and it has to show at least three main things. A voice from the top, this is important. Policy to clarify expectations and responsibilities. This is very difficult to implement, but you have to implement it essentially so that it makes sense for every single person in your institution. Having the Singapore Statement or having the basic principles just on a website is not good enough. Seeing the advances here and understanding the advances here in Korea, where the engagement between integrity and people and researchers, it's just amazing. This is what we have to do in Australia. Research integrity must have its own infrastructure at an institution. And this now is being strongly argued for people who don't believe that research is very reproducible. So researchers from companies and private research institutions who have tried to go back and replicate work in clinical research. And normally, it only works about 25% of the time. A large number of research is not reproducible. Some key things of the infrastructure are the idea of advice networks and mentoring, data management systems, and being able and being responsible when you respond to a breach, so people can speak up. In a new argument, there's more argument about having robust critique of research. This is very easy in perhaps small medical research institutions or small concentrated areas to implement that. It's harder for large systems. And everywhere we go now, people ask for new reward systems for promotions. So in Australia, it's very heavily dependent on citations and publications. Is that the right thing? Probably. People say it's pushing the fraud triangle in a different way. The University of Melbourne has made a response to plagiarism. And what we've tried to do is be positive about this. We don't really use the term plagiarism very much. What we talk about is becoming a scholar. We talk about scholarship and then practical advice about how to cite work, how to reference work in the different disciplines, and importantly, how to paraphrase, how to take another idea and another expression and re-synthesize that in your own way so that you add more information. What we're working on is generating a policy framework that is based around the ideas, the principles, and then more and more application, more and more instruction, to the point where different disciplines have their own guidelines on how to cite work and how much is responsible recycling, how much can be done. What's the incentive? Why should we even do this if it's just normal and it happens all the time in a very, very small frequency? People plagiarise. This article here, which is pretty new in nature, is an argument for more research integrity infrastructure and compliance through a stick. So if you don't have a good infrastructure, you don't get money from funding bodies. We've thought about a carrot, and come with us, a journey, please. So when you look at research, everywhere you look at research and research output and interaction, there's metrics. People are trying to measure research impact all the time. It used to just be citations and journal impact factor and how many books you published, how many book chapters, monographs. But now look, if you tweet about your research, you will get more citations. So people are now looking at Twitter, people looking at communities online of disciplines like the Faculty 1000 about how they assess work. All these together are aggregated at individuals and institutions to greatly inform the strategy of an institution for research. And then you ask, well, where's the research integrity metric? Can we have one? Is it possible? Is it possible? We've thought about it maybe that it's like golf, or maybe it's just a very slow metric. So one idea is a metric where, because this is normal, and everyone normally does this 98% of the time, everyone just gets 1 point. Every paper has 1 point, and slowly over time, it gets more and more. You get more and more points. Or maybe it's like golf, and you want to get the lowest score possible. So every time you're found to plagiarise or have a problem, you get 1 point. It doesn't seem like very good incentive. It seems like a bad metric. So where's the value? So we were thinking that perhaps at article levels and individual levels, we could measure markers or indicators of integrity, contribution statements for authorship, so that you tell everyone who did what. Authorship is a very terrible tool, a blunt tool, to tell the reader about who contributed. Authorship contribution statements are very valuable. The idea of managing conflicts of interest, the ability to share data and sharing of open access, and then there are very interesting reporting standards that the journals are getting behind. These could be all aggregated. These article level ones could be aggregated at an individual level, and then again for an institution, where not only do we look at this, but we look at the main things, really the 3 key things of leadership, policy, education and training, and what does the infrastructure look like for research integrity. We need to do this because measurement puts a number on something. Or in a qualitative assessment, you look at the quality of something. This generates, once you do that, you start generating an automatic incentive, because you can compare one institution to another. This is important because, well, this is an idea. It might not be important, but it doesn't sound right compared to the normal narrative around integrity and ethics. We should really just be doing this ourselves responsibly. And that's what it appears to me and us that Korea is doing, that we're taking responsibility for this. But on the ground, in an office of research integrity at an institution, we need money. We need money and we need more people to help researchers. And the only way one of the ways we can do that and discuss that with our institution leaders is by having a ladder, by having a table that says Melbourne University is not number 1, and we should be number 1. The incentivisation of this. So to summarise, research is predictably unpredictable. The principles of research integrity make research trustworthy and excellent. Plagiarism really is an academic theft, and there's no such thing as plagiarism, but please recycle. It is okay to recycle sometimes, and please be generous. Despite recent advances in plagiarism, in detection of plagiarism perhaps, it still requires humans. It must require humans to make a judgment. And institutions can always do more. But we have to perhaps change the game. We have to change perhaps the narrative, the story around how we can get more. And that's how we generate perhaps competition between institutions, which can be fun. This is a great privilege to be here and a wonderful opportunity. Thank you very much, Professor Lee. Thank you very much for the invitation, kind invitation. And thank you to the Ministry of Education, NRF, and KAOAS. Chaos, yeah. Thank you very much for the sponsorship. Thank you. Kamsahamnida, kamsahamnida.